actually the last chapter.
Oh, wow. So good.
Well, we have a wrap-up coming up after.
Oh, good.
Put it all together. But chapter 6 today is on stories.
I like stories.
Everybody loves stories. You know, go to the movies, we read books, we tell stories. Everybody likes
Wait, we're not gonna have another kidney story, right? I just got my food.
Give me ice, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to read a story. The nurse was working at the neonatal intensive care unit where newborns with serious health problems are treated and monitored. She had been watching one baby in particular for several hours, and she didn't like what she was seeing. His color, a key indicator of potential problems, had been fluctuating, wavering between a healthy shade of pink and a duller, more troublesome blue hue. Suddenly, within a matter of seconds, the baby turned a deep blue-black. The nurse's stomach fell. Others in the ICU yelled for an X-ray technician and a doctor. The gathering medical team was operating on the assumption that the baby's lung had collapsed, a common problem for babies on ventilators. The team prepared for the typical response to a collapsed lung, which involves piercing the chest and inserting a tube to suck the air from the collapsed lung, allowing it to reinflate. But the nurse thought it was a heart problem. As soon as she saw the baby's color, the awful blue-black, she suspected a pneumopericardium, a condition in which the air fills the sac surrounding the heart, pressing inward and preventing the heart from beating. The nurse was terrified because the last time she witnessed a pneumopericardium, the baby died before the problem could even be diagnosed. The nurse tried to stop the frantic preparations to treat the lung. "It's the heart," she said. But in response, the other medical personnel pointed to the heart monitor, which showed that the baby's heart was fine. His heart rate was bouncing along steadily at the normal newborn rate of 130 beats per minute. The nurse, still insistent, pushed their hands away and screamed for quiet as she lowered a stethoscope to check for a heartbeat. There was no sound. The heart was not beating. She started doing compressions on the baby's chest. The chief neonatalist burst into the room, and the nurse slapped a syringe in his hand. "It's a pneumopericardium," she said. "Stick to heart." The X-ray technician, who was finally receiving results from his scan, confirmed the nurse's diagnosis. The neonatalist guided the syringe into the heart and slowly released the air that had been strangling the baby's heart. The baby's life was saved. His color slowly returned to normal. Later, the group realized why the heart monitor misled them. It is designed to measure electrical activity, not actual heartbeat. The baby's heart nerves were firing, telling the heart to beat at the appropriate rate, but the air in the sac around the heart prevented the heart from actually beating. Only when the nurse used the stethoscope so that she could hear whether the heart was pumping correctly, did it become clear that his heart had stopped. So that's a story in a collection of stories, but it illustrates what I want to talk about a little bit this morning, and that is that having been a nurse and having been with first responders, firefighters, things like that, we tell stories to each other to do what? To educate people and also to inspire people. If you look at like Chicken Soup for the Soul and how big a phenomenon that is, you know that people like to read or hear inspiring stories. So we tell stories to educate and inspire. So a key to making an idea sticky is to tell a story. Stories encourage a kind of mental stimulation or reenactment on the part of the listener that burns the idea into the mind. For example, a flight simulator is much more effective than flashcards in training a pilot. But the hard part about using a story is creating it. So part of what making an idea sticky is being able to spot sticky ideas. You don't have to make them up all the time yourself, but you should be able to spot sticky ideas using the success list. And we'll talk about that more at my next presentation as we wrap it all up. So the best way to use a story is always to be on the lookout for them. Most good stories are collected and discovered rather than produced. So in the book they talk about Jared, and I think I mentioned Jared once before, the Subway guy that lost 245 pounds by eating at the restaurant, Subway, sandwiches twice a day. Originally, Subway was going to go with a marketing idea called 6 under 7, 6 sandwiches with less than 7 grams of fat. Now, Jared's story or the 6 under 7, which is more sticky, okay? It doesn't take rocket science to figure that one out. So he lost 245 pounds of fat by eating there, and there was a lot of resistance on the part of Subway to go ahead and use that story. It really took a lot. And I won't bore you with the details, but it's quite an amazing story in and of itself. So when we're talking about stories, there's basically 3 different kinds of plots in a story. There's the challenge plot, and this is the classic underdog, rags to riches, or sheer willpower triumphing over adversity. The key element of the challenge plot is that obstacles seem daunting by the protagonist. In this case, Jared with his 245 pounds. So it would be the David and Goliath type of a story. David with his slingshot takes down the giant. That's a challenge plot. The second one is a connection plot. It's a story about people who develop a relationship that bridges a gap, racial, class, ethnic, religious, demographic, or otherwise. There was a commercial in the 1970s with Mean Joe Green where he befriends a little white boy. That's a classic connection plot. The Good Samaritan story in the Bible would also be a classic connection. If you're connecting with somebody, it's your love stories. Think of, when I'm talking about the different kinds of plots, think of the movies. So you have your challenge plot where you have the underdog. In the connection plot, it's it's the Good Samaritan in the Bible. And that story, you guys know, basically the Good Samaritan. Back in those days, the Good Samaritan, the actual person that actually helped him, was of a different class and they would not normally associate. So if you're making friends, you're connecting, or there's a relationship involved, it could be the connection plot. And the last one is the creativity plot. And this involves someone making a mental breakthrough, solving a long-standing puzzle, or attacking a problem in an innovative way. The example that they gave on that one is the apple falling on Newton's head. And then he came up with gravity as a result of that. So that would be a creativity plot. And let's see. Okay, so we talk about originally the curse of knowledge, and the curse of knowledge is what? You have
Too many options. Knowing too much, too many options.
Right, it's the expert, it's the tapper and the listener, right? So you're tapping it out, and you have the song in your head, but the listener doesn't know what that song is. So you have the knowledge in your head, and the person that you're talking to doesn't necessarily have that knowledge, but you think that they do, and that they are understanding what you're communicating. So the example that they give is people talking about like keeping the lines of communication open. They are hearing in their heads a song filled with passion and emotion. But they're remembering the experience that taught them those lessons, the struggles, the political battles, the missteps, the pain. They are tapping, as described in the first chapter of the book. They need to share their story with trials. But the person that's listening doesn't have those same experiences, so they don't know. Stories bridge that gap. They help us to understand and break that curse of knowledge. So one of the examples that they gave in the book was a Xerox repairman. If you guys, anybody has Xerox copiers in their offices now, it's not as prevalent as it used to be, but they're very technologically advanced machines. They're optical. So they're very advanced. We'll leave it there. And so they're talking about, this repairman's talking about, well, there was a dichlorotron that was bad in the machine. I was getting a 503 error, and so we fixed it. And they're talking he's talking at lunch with his buddies. Why do they do that? Why do we tell stories with each other? Because it draws us into the story. We see ourselves in the story. We put ourselves there in that situation, and we learn by doing so. So stories is a great way to break the curse of knowledge. You've probably heard facts tell, but stories sell. So use stories in trying to get your point across and trying to talk about your business and making your ideas sticky. Stories usually automatically also meet other criteria for making ideas sticky. They're almost always concrete, they're often emotional, and have unexpected elements. But the real difficulty is to make sure that they are simple enough. Don't make your story so complex that you lose the people that you're talking to. So, wrapping it up for stories, you want to make sure that they're tell stories, and stories have an amazing dual power to stimulate and inspire, and stories naturally embody most of the stickiness factors. The hardest part is to make sure that they're simple. So that's it.
Does anybody have any comments or questions about
Sticky
what Gary
stories?
was saying? Any experiences with stories or something like that?
Of constructive criticism.
Go for it.
Actually, I was sitting here listening to what Gary was saying, and I kind of pride myself on being able to take some difficult situations like a mold, problem or something like that, and being able to make it relatable and dumbing it down, which is a term I never use, but really it's bringing it down to a comprehension level that anybody can understand. And man, when you said that about using stories, and I was thinking the word relatable, because that's why we tell stories, is to relate really with one another. That's really how I use I use stories to be able to relate things to people, and I've noticed that when I do that people kind of grasp or understand that. So that it was very, very interesting what you said there about that. I like. It's kind of interesting when you become conscious of, oh yeah, that's
But according to the
an idea.
success principles, what he's talking about is making it, like you said, not dumbing it down, but making it simple. And then the other part is making it concrete so that people can understand what it is that you're trying to convey.
Oh, sorry. Thank you,
And
sir.
do that with stories.
Yeah.
I was on a team one time, and the leader of the team said, I don't really care if you come back with a signed application, but do not come back unless you've got their story. He knew how to use this information quite effectively.
Because that's more.
Yeah, it's the way that we relate in business and in
Yeah,
personal
so that's a
relationships.
good point. Not only to tell a story, but to listen to your client's stories too.
Mhm.
Because that's
Mhm.
absolutely.
Because they'll reveal a lot if you do listen to this story. They'll tell you a lot about them, and then you'll know how to apply what we were talking about last week. It's taking that emotion and seeing what they're about, what's important to them. Because everybody has a story.
And you can find a story in almost anything.
Yeah.
It depends on, the angle, or if you have a topic in mind, you can almost find something that fits that topic. Or if you look at a situation, you can figure out different stories from that situation. It was helpful to me. I used to go down to the Old Town Mission on Fridays and do a lunchtime devotional, 5-minute devotional. So I would have to come up with some kind of story. What was I going to do? Stand there and read, the Bible, or stand there and pray for 5 minutes? No, I had to come up with some kind of story. So.
And that's what makes it stick.
Yeah.
It does, because they're much more likely to remember the story than just standing up there. It's what I said about the facts. Facts tell, the stories sell. People are going to remember.
It's very interesting because especially where we came from, history and stories, things were passed orally. That's kind of makes sense. That's the way that our brains work, to be able to store information and that kind of thing. Learn from our ancestors or their mistakes and things like that. Those stories are passed on, orally. It makes sense that our brains work that way. That's kind of cool.
Well, it's really interesting. You bring up the brain. They did a study, and they talked about it in this chapter. They did a study with college students where they asked them to identify a problem that they were having, whether a relationship or in school. They broke them into 3 different groups. One group was the group where they just, after they said, pick a problem, then go home and come back in another week and just review the problem. The second group, they said, we want you to go home, pick a problem, go home, take a look at what happened, and project where you're going or what would be the outcome, a beneficial outcome of this. And then they had a third group that actually they said, we want you to take a look at this problem and in detail go over in your mind what happened, what you were saying to that person, what took place and that kind of stuff. And then they sent them home. Well, the people that actually, the third group, the people that actually went through the problem, what they said to the person, how they spoke to them, what the whole thing, actually the third group did better because, and the gist of that is pop psychology will tell you to go ahead and visualize, if you want to be rich, visualize yourself being wealthy. But the data that's coming back now said if you want to be rich, using that analogy, look at what is the problem that's preventing you from being rich. So take a look at the problem, walk through it, go through the detail of it. Because the mind actually compartmentalizes things. So the example that they give in the book is that they were telling a story about a guy who put a sweatshirt on before he went out to run. The mind is still on that. And so there's two groups. And they actually tested people as they were reading it on the computer, and the people that he took the sweatshirt off in one story and he left the sweatshirt on in the other story. And so people actually slowed down because they're going, well, where's that sweatshirt at? Even though he went out and
Because they're
running.
working on the problem.
Because they're still working on that. They're putting themselves in that situation, and they're somewhere in the brain, they're still back in that part where there's. So it is sticky, it catches people. But so the story of that was, visualization and all that is good, but actually part of it is that if you actually look at in detail and go over what has happened, what has transpired, your conversations with people, your mood is actually going to be better elevated as a result of that than going into the problem solving part of it instead of going into the futuring part of it.
How, not why. Power of how do I fix this problem instead of why do I have this problem.
But the brain is very powerful.
It
It's
is.
amazing what it can do.
And my tax conventions that I go to, they, of course, it is a lot of information, and even though I do it for a living, it's very boring sometimes. You have presenters and slides and stuff like that. But all the presenters, there's two really good ones. They tell stories about what's happened with their client that relates to what's on the screen. And that's how I learn
That's how you remember it.
more
Yep.
about that particular thing than the big booklet they give you to take home.
Because that's stickier.
Yeah.
It is stickier.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Gary. So then now, next week you're gonna wrap everything up, is that?
Well, next week I'm actually